There is a bunker outside Moscow where, on a Tuesday night in September 1983, one man sat alone and watched a screen tell him that the world was about to end. The screen said 5 American nuclear missiles were inbound. The alarm was screaming. Every protocol the Soviet military had written, every chain of command, every piece of training this man had received told him one thing: report it immediately as a real attack so that the Soviet Union could launch its counterstrike before the missiles landed. He had somewhere between 4 and 10 minutes to decide. He decided the system was wrong. He was right. But he did not know that when he made the decision. He made it on instinct, on doubt, on a feeling he could not fully explain even to himself. And because of that feeling, somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion people who are alive today continued to be alive. His name was Stanislav Petrov. And for 15 years after that night, almost nobody on Earth knew what he had done. To understand why September 26, 1983 was so dangerous, you have to understand what 1983 actually felt like inside the Soviet military establishment. From inside the Kremlin, the world looked like it was building towards something catastrophic. Ronald Reagan had taken office in 1981, declaring the Soviet Union an evil empire. That phrase landed in Moscow not as political theater, but as a genuine signal of American intent. The Reagan administration had dramatically accelerated military spending, announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile defense system that the Soviets correctly recognized would give the United States a first strike advantage if it worked, and stationed new Pershing II ballistic missiles in West Germany, close enough to reach Moscow in less than 10 minutes. Inside Soviet intelligence, an assessment had been circulating since 1981 called Operation Ryan, Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, which translated roughly as nuclear missile attack. The KGB and the GRU had concluded that the Americans might actually be planning a surprise nuclear first strike, and they had set up a global network of intelligence officers to watch for the specific signs that such an attack was being prepared. Unusual activity at military bases, changes in banking hours, and the stockpiling of blood supplies at hospitals. The paranoia was not irrational given what the Soviets knew and believed. What they did not know was that the Americans were not planning a first strike. What everybody missed was how close that mutual paranoia was bringing both sides to triggering a war that neither actually wanted. Then, in September 1983, 3 weeks before the night in question, a Soviet Su-15 interceptor shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 over Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard, including a sitting United States congressman. The international outrage was enormous. Reagan called it a crime against humanity. The Soviets, who had genuinely believed the aircraft might be a military reconnaissance mission, were baffled and defensive. The diplomatic temperature between Washington and Moscow hit a level not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. It was into this atmosphere, 3 weeks after the KAL-007 shootdown, that Stanislav Petrov reported for duty at Serpukhov 15. Serpukhov 15 was a secret Soviet nuclear early warning facility buried in a command bunker south of Moscow. Its official designation was the Oko system, which means eye in Russian, and its purpose was exactly what the name implied: to watch American missile silos and give the Soviet military the maximum possible warning time before an incoming nuclear strike. The facility used satellites positioned in highly elliptical orbits over the United States, satellites that would detect the infrared signature of a missile launch and relay the alert to the bunker within seconds. Petrov was a lieutenant colonel, 44 years old, an engineer by training who had helped develop the Oko system himself and therefore understood its capabilities and its limitations better than almost anyone else in the Soviet military. On the night of September 25th going into the 26th, he was the duty officer, the man responsible for monitoring the system and making the initial assessment of any alerts. He was not, strictly speaking, supposed to be there that night. The officer who normally worked that shift had called in sick. Petrov had been reassigned. He would later say that this bothered him slightly. He preferred his regular schedule. At 12 minutes past midnight, Moscow time, the alarm sounded. On the screen in front of Petrov, a single word appeared in large red letters: launch. The Oko satellite was reporting a missile launch from a base in the United States. The sirens in the bunker were wailing. The board was showing the highest possible alert level. Petrov's job in this moment was clearly defined by Soviet military protocol: verify the report with a secondary system, then immediately notify his superiors in the Soviet military chain of command, who would notify the Defense Ministry, who would notify the Kremlin, where the decision about a retaliatory strike would be made. He had, by his own later estimation, somewhere between 4 and 10 minutes before the reported missile would reach Soviet territory. Less time than it takes to watch a television episode. Less time than most people spend deciding what to eat for dinner. He picked up the phone to report to his superior officer at the warning center, General Yuri Votintsev. He held the receiver for a moment. He did not make the call. He put the receiver down and looked at the screen again. Something was wrong. He couldn't immediately articulate what, but something about this didn't feel right to him. The first thing that bothered Petrov was the number. The Oko system was reporting a single missile launch. A single missile. Petrov had studied American nuclear doctrine. He understood how the United States planned to fight a nuclear war. And if the Americans were launching a first strike, the entire logic of nuclear warfare dictated that they would launch everything simultaneously, or as close to simultaneously as possible, to overwhelm Soviet air defenses before a counterstrike could be ordered. One missile made no sense. One missile could be intercepted. One missile was not how you start a nuclear war. The second thing that bothered him was the ground radar. The Oko satellite system was designed to work in conjunction with ground-based over-the-horizon radar stations that would provide independent confirmation of any launch. Those stations had not yet reported anything. The protocol was clear that satellite detection alone, without ground radar confirmation, was an insufficient basis for a launch alert. But the sirens were still going, and the board still said launch, and he was still the only person in the bunker who had the authority to make the initial call. Then the screen changed. A second missile appeared, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. The system was now reporting 5 inbound intercontinental ballistic missiles, all launched from the same American base, all tracking toward Soviet territory. The alert level on the board climbed to its highest setting. The word that appeared now was not launch, it was missile attack. The noise in the bunker was immense. Petrov later described the scene around him as utter chaos, with staff officers shouting and the alarms cycling and everyone looking at him, waiting for him to pick up the phone. He did not pick up the phone. 5 missiles still didn't feel right to him. The number was wrong in a different way now. Not too many, too few. If the Americans were launching a first strike with 5 missiles, they were not launching a first strike. They were launching something that didn't make operational sense in any nuclear war scenario Petrov had ever studied. A real American attack would involve hundreds of warheads, not 5. He also, in these few minutes, thought about the system itself. He had helped design it. He knew its history. He knew that the satellites used infrared sensors to detect the heat signatures of rocket exhaust, and he knew the sensors could be triggered by reflected sunlight. He knew that under certain atmospheric conditions, Certain angles of sunlight reflecting off clouds could produce readings that resembled rocket exhaust. He knew the system had produced anomalous readings before. He knew it was not perfect. He did not know in that moment whether this was one of those anomalous readings or a real attack. He would later say, plainly and without drama, that he was not certain. He was about 50-50. He was guessing, but he decided not to report it as a real attack. He called his superior and reported a system malfunction, a false alarm. He sat at his station, sweating through his uniform, and waited for the missiles to either arrive or not arrive. They did not arrive. The cause of the false alarm, when engineers investigated over the following days, turned out to be a once-in-a-decade confluence of sunlight, satellite angle, and high-altitude cloud cover above North Dakota. The Oko satellite had been positioned at an unusual angle relative to the sun and had interpreted the reflected sunlight off the cloud tops as the infrared signature of multiple missile launches. It was, in every technical sense, a perfect storm of sensor conditions that the system had never been designed to handle. The system that the Soviet Union had built at enormous expense to prevent a nuclear war by giving the Kremlin maximum warning time had, on September 26, 1983, nearly started one. Now here's the part that is important to sit with for a moment. If Petrov had followed protocol, he would have reported 5 inbound missiles to his commanding general. His commanding general would have had no choice but to report it up the chain. The Soviet military doctrine of the time, shaped by the knowledge that American Pershing II missiles could reach Moscow in under 10 minutes, was built around the principle of launch on warning. You do not wait to confirm impact before retaliating, because if you wait, your missiles are destroyed in their silos, and you have nothing left to retaliate with. The entire logic of Soviet nuclear deterrence depended on the credibility of an immediate counterstrike. The Soviet Union, in 1983, had approximately 35,000 nuclear warheads. The United States had approximately 23,000. The strategic war plans on both sides called for the near simultaneous launch of thousands of those warheads in the event of a confirmed attack. American cities, Soviet cities, military bases, communication infrastructure, ports, industrial centers, all of it, gone within the first 30 minutes. Estimates of immediate deaths range from 500 million to over 1 billion people, depending on which models you use. The subsequent nuclear winter, the collapse of agriculture from the dust and ash blocking sunlight, would likely have killed a comparable number over the following months and years. This is not hypothetical. This is what the war plans said. This is what the missiles were pointed at. This is what Stanislav Petrov stopped on a Tuesday night in a bunker outside Moscow by deciding not to pick up the phone. What happened to him afterward is one of the stranger aspects of this story. He was not celebrated. He was not promoted. He was not even officially acknowledged. The Soviet military, confronted with the evidence that their billion-ruble early warning system had nearly triggered a nuclear war because of sunlight on clouds, did what large institutions typically do when confronted with catastrophic evidence of their own failure. They buried it. Petrov was subjected to a military investigation, not as a hero, but as a potential problem. The investigators acknowledged that his decision had been correct in outcome, but criticized him for incomplete paperwork. On the night of the incident, in the chaos of the bunker, he had not properly filled out the duty log. This was technically a violation of regulations. He received a formal reprimand. He was never promoted again. He retired from the Soviet military in 1984, the year after the incident, at the relatively junior rank of lieutenant colonel, and took a job as a civilian engineer at the same research institute where he had worked before. He lived quietly in a small apartment in Fryazevo, a town about 30 miles east of Moscow. He did not discuss what had happened on September 26, 1983 with anyone who did not already know. For 15 years, the story existed only in classified Soviet military files. The first person in the Western world to learn what had happened was a British intelligence officer, Oleg Gordievsky, who had been a KGB officer and double agent for MI6 for more than a decade before defecting to Britain in 1985. Gordievsky had access to Soviet intelligence files and had heard enough of the story to pass it to his British handlers. But his account was fragmentary, and for years it remained buried in classified British intelligence files. The full story began to emerge only after the Soviet Union collapsed, when Russian and American historians and intelligence officials began comparing notes on the near disasters of the Cold War. In 1998, a former Soviet colonel named Oleg Kalugin discussed the incident in a book about his career. The story then reached journalists. Petrov was located at his apartment in Fryazevo, and he agreed to speak. He was 59 years old. He had been living with this story for 15 years, telling almost no one. What followed was a strange late chapter in an already strange life. Petrov was flown to the United States in 2006 to receive an award from a private nuclear disarmament organization at United Nations headquarters in New York City. He was photographed shaking hands with dignitaries. He gave a short speech. He seemed uncomfortable with the attention in the way that people who have actually done something are often uncomfortable with attention, as opposed to people who have merely been celebrated. He told interviewers repeatedly that he did not consider himself a hero. He said the decision he made was the right one, but that he had not been certain, and that if the situation had been slightly different, he might have made the wrong one. He pointed out that if the system had reported 10 missiles instead of 5, or if the ground radar had also malfunctioned and produced a false confirmation, he probably would have reported it as real. He was not trying to be modest. He seemed genuinely disturbed by how contingent the outcome had been. His wife Raisa developed cancer in the late 1990s and died after a long illness. Petrov spoke about her in interviews more than he spoke about the events of 1983. He said that her death had been harder for him than the night in the bunker, which he experienced mostly as professional stress at the time and only later understood. Once the story became public in its full historical weight, he continued to live in his small apartment in Fryazevo. He received a modest pension. He was interviewed by documentary filmmakers and journalists from around the world. He won a Dresden Peace Prize in 2013. He was 77 years old at the ceremony, and he looked frail. He died on May 19, 2017, at the age of 77 in his apartment. His death was not widely reported for several months. His son was the one who eventually notified journalists. There is something in the shape of Stanislav Petrov's life that resists the usual way we tell stories about heroism. He did not charge a machine gun nest. He did not pull someone from a burning building. He did not do anything visible at all. He sat at a desk and decided not to make a phone call. The heroism was entirely interior, a quiet refusal to do what every system around him was designed to make him do: to report the alarm, to follow the protocol, to hand the decision up the chain where someone with more authority could get it wrong on a larger scale. He later said that he had always believed his superiors, if he had reported it as real, would have made the right decision. He said this in a way that suggested he was not entirely certain he believed it, and that this uncertainty had been part of his calculation on that night. The OKO early warning system that produced the false alarm was kept in operation by the Soviet military for years after the incident. The specific satellite that triggered the false alarm was eventually taken out of service, but the fundamental vulnerability that caused the problem The system's susceptibility to certain angles of reflected sunlight was not fully corrected for more than a decade. The Soviet government never publicly acknowledged that the incident had occurred. The Russian government has acknowledged it since the story became public, but without particular emphasis or ceremony. There is no monument to Stanislav Petrov in Russia. There is no national holiday. The street in Fryazevo where he lived has not been renamed. The United States and Russia today maintain a combined arsenal of approximately 12,000 nuclear warheads, down significantly from the 1983 peak, but still enough to end human civilization several times over. The early warning systems on both sides are substantially more sophisticated than the OCO satellites of 1983, but they are not infallible, and the timelines have not changed. If an American early warning system today reported an inbound Russian missile, the President of the United States would have approximately 6 minutes to decide whether to launch a counterstrike before the missile hit. If a Russian system reported an inbound American missile, the decision timeline on their side is comparable. The logic of mutually assured destruction, the strategic doctrine that has prevented nuclear war since 1945 by making it suicidal for either side to start one, depends entirely on the accuracy of the systems providing the warning information. On September 26, 1983, those systems failed. The thing that saved the world was one man's gut feeling that something didn't add up. Stanislav Petrov was asked many times in his later years whether he thought he deserved the recognition he eventually received. He always deflected the question. He said he had just been doing his job, and then he would pause, and then he would say that perhaps doing your job in that moment had required something more than just doing your job. He never seemed to fully resolve that contradiction for himself. What is clear is that he understood, more than most, how narrow the margin had been, not just on that night, but in the decades before it, and the decades since. The margin between the world that exists and the one that almost came into being on a Tuesday night in September 1983 was not strategy or doctrine or diplomatic skill. It was one man's hesitation, one man's doubt, one man deciding, with less than 10 minutes and no certainty, that the alarm was probably wrong. He was right, and the word probably is the part that should stay with you. If you want to go further into the Cold War near disasters that almost ended everything, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and most of them are just as close as this one.